An older veteran simply wanted to do a good deed, but younger officers publicly humiliated him by mocking his tattoo. Little did they know that the faded symbol would stun the FBI itself. The sun was barely kissing the horizon, painting the sky above Evergreen Heights, Florida, in the softest blush of pink and orange. A gentle, salty breeze, carrying the faint scent of the nearby Gulf, whispered through the palm trees lining Palm Ridge Boulevard. Inside the Morning Glory Cafe, a quaint little diner known for its artisanal coffee and crispy bacon, the day had already begun to hum with the low murmur of early risers and the clatter of ceramic mugs. It was a familiar symphony, one that Orrin Kincaid had come to cherish. Orrin, a man whose 75 years sat lightly upon his shoulders, despite the deep etchings time had carved into his face, nursed a mug of black coffee by the window. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, wrapped around the warmth of the ceramic. A small comfort in the quiet dawn. His eyes, once a piercing blue, now held a slight haze of time, yet still possessed a profound depth of wisdom and an unsettling calm. He wore a well-worn, neatly pressed flannel shirt, faded denim jeans, and scrupulously clean, albeit old, work boots. His sparse gray hair, receding at the temples, was meticulously combed. On his left forearm, barely visible beneath the sleeve, a faded, almost indistinguishable tattoo lay hidden. To an uninformed observer, it might have seemed like a crude, angular scribble, perhaps a misguided youthful escapade, or a child's amateurish drawing. Coming here each morning was Orrin's sacred ritual, a brief sanctuary before the day's demands began to press in. Today, however, his usual quiet contemplation was interrupted by a subtle drama unfolding at the next table. A young couple, barely out of their teens, sat hunched over their half-eaten breakfast. Their voices were hushed, laced with an undeniable strain, but snippets about not enough cash and a declined card drifted across the aisle. The girl's cheeks were flushed with embarrassment as she whispered to her companion, who nervously fiddled with a napkin, avoiding the waitress's eye. Without a second thought, Orrin subtly raised a hand, catching the attention of Evelyn, the young waitress who knew his usual order by heart. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice soft, almost imperceptible amidst the diner's gentle hum. "Be a dear, and add their tab to mine. Consider it my treat." Evelyn, accustomed to Orrin's quiet acts of kindness, offered a warm smile and a nod. She approached the young couple, speaking in a low, reassuring tone, and their faces, previously etched with anxiety, blossomed with profound relief and gratitude. The young man began to protest, but Evelyn simply gestured towards Orrin, who was already pushing himself up from his table, ready to depart. The couple turned, their eyes meeting his. Orrin offered a slight, knowing smile and a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of their predicament and his small gesture of solidarity, before turning towards the exit. He sought no accolades, no gushing thanks. His simple intention was to alleviate their immediate burden. Stepping out of the diner, Orrin found the morning air warmer, losing its initial crispness. He inhaled deeply, savoring the brief moment of tranquility before the city's true cacophony would begin. Yet his solitude was fleeting. Leaning casually against a parked patrol car at the curb were two young police officers, their uniforms starched and sharp, their badges glinting in the nascent sunlight. Officer Kalen Thorne, tall and broad-shouldered with a fresh buzz cut and an insufferably smug grin, stood beside Officer Silas Croft, slightly shorter and leaner, but radiating the same air of condescending authority. They had just finished their own breakfast inside the Morning Glory Cafe, and had, it seemed, taken notice of Orrin's subtle act of generosity. "Hold up there, Grandpa! What's the rush?" Thorne called out, his voice dripping with thinly veiled amusement and superiority. Oren paused, turning slowly to face them. His expression remained unruffled. "Good morning, officers. I was simply heading home." His tone was even, devoid of any discernible irritation. "Home, you say?" Croft smirked, stepping forward, his gaze sweeping over Oren before settling on his arm. "And what's this on your arm, old-timer? A masterpiece of modern art, perhaps?" He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist towards Oren's faded tattoo. "Looks like something someone got done in a back alley, probably while passed out. What is that, anyway? Some kind of prison mark?" Thorne chuckled, joining in the mockery. "Oh, come on, Silas. Maybe his grandchild drew it when they were 5, and Grandpa thought it was, like, totally cool." He sauntered closer, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the faded symbol. "Seriously, old man, what are those scribbles? And why is it so old? Couldn't afford a proper one?" Oren felt a slow burn of irritation begin to smolder within him, but he expertly suppressed it. He had encountered countless individuals like these young officers throughout his long life, arrogant, brimming with a self-importance derived solely from their uniform and their perceived authority. "That is not your concern, officers," he responded, his voice still calm as he attempted to walk around them. But Thorne blocked his path, a proprietary smirk on his face. Whoa. Easy there, Grandpa. We're asking the questions here. And you, it seems, aren't being very cooperative. Maybe you have something to hide? Like, why are you so generous with your money? Is it dirty money, perhaps?" Croft pulled out his notepad, clicking his pen with an exaggerated flourish. "ID, please, and explain what you're doing out at this hour. And why you look so... peculiar?" "Peculiar?" Oren raised an eyebrow, a flicker of dry amusement in his eyes, quickly masked. "I am simply an elderly gentleman who has just had breakfast." "Well, you know, not every elderly gentleman looks quite so, interesting," Thorne drawled, again gesturing at the tattoo. "And not every elderly gentleman is so freely handing out cash. Maybe you're looking to scam someone? Or are you involved in something illegal?" Their voices, laced with open disdain, carried easily in the quiet morning, drawing the attention of passers-by. Several people, emerging from the cafe, paused, their gazes shifting between the officers and Oren. Oren felt the weight of their curious stares, a sharp prick of public scrutiny, but he refused to let it destabilize him. He reached into his wallet, his movements deliberate, and slowly extracted his driver's license, extending it towards Croft. Croft took the license, glancing at it with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Oren Kincaid, 75 years old. So, Oren, what's with the tattoo, huh? Enlighten us. Were you in some gang back in the day? Or is it a mark of some secret society?" He snickered, tossing the license to Thorne, who also examined it with a condescending sneer. "It is simply an old tattoo," Oren reiterated, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "It bears no relevance to what I just did, nor to what I am doing now." "Everything is relevant, Grandpa," Thorne countered, taking a step closer, his face inches from Oren's. "We're here to maintain order, and if someone looks suspicious or acts strangely, we have every right to ask questions. And you, old man, look very suspicious. And that tattoo, it just screams that you're hiding something." He made a show of examining it with pseudo-academic interest. "Looks like some ancient symbol. Maybe you're part of a cult." Croft snorted. "Oh, come on, Kalen. He's just an old eccentric. He probably doesn't even remember what it is himself. Probably got it when he was drunk." Their words were steeped in open contempt, and Oren felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to fray. He had witnessed much in his life, survived more than these young men could ever conceive. He knew the true face of danger, of injustice. And these two, with their empty eyes and arrogant sneers, were mere shadows of the tribulations he had endured. Yet, Their overt disrespect, their humiliating pronouncements directed at him simply because of his age, were deeply, profoundly offensive. "I am not obligated to explain anything to you," Oren stated, extending his hand for his license. "You have verified my identification. I am breaking no law. I simply wish to go home." Thorn made no move to return the license. He held it aloft, dangling it tantalizingly before Oren's face. "Well, we're not quite finished with our investigation, Grandpa. Maybe we should check if you have anything interesting in your pockets. Or perhaps in your car. You drove here, didn't you?" "I do not own a car," Oren replied. "I reside 2 blocks from here." "Oh, so you're a pedestrian?" Croft feigned surprise. "And you don't have a car? And you're so generous? This is all becoming even more suspicious, don't you think?" Oren gritted his teeth. He wanted to avoid a confrontation, but he felt them systematically crossing every boundary. Their objective was glaringly obvious: to humiliate him, to assert their petty authority. And he was not about to permit it. "I request that you return my documents," Oren stated, his voice low and even, yet imbued with an underlying steel that the officers, in their arrogance, seemed entirely oblivious to. "And permit me to proceed." "Or what, Grandpa?" Thorn took another step forward, his face close to Oren's. "What are you going to do to us? Report us to the chief? You think they'll believe an old oddball with such a ridiculous tattoo?" He again pointed at Oren's forearm, his finger almost brushing the skin. "What the heck is that, anyway? Looks like someone drew a bird, but forgot what birds look like." Croft snickered. "Or like someone tried to draw a treasure map. And it all went horribly wrong." Oren met their gazes, his eyes narrowing to slits. He saw in them not merely young, inexperienced officers, but the embodiment of the indifference and disrespect he so often observed in society towards the elderly. They perceived him as nothing more than an old, helpless man, ripe for unpunished humiliation. But they were profoundly mistaken. "You will regret this," Oren murmured softly, almost to himself, yet with an undeniable resonance. Thorn and Croft merely laughed louder, their mirth ringing harshly in the morning air. "Whoa, threats? Grandpa, you're really scaring us," Thorn sneered, stepping back but still clutching Oren's license. "Maybe we should just take you down to the station. There, you can tell us all your tall tales about tattoos and threats." The situation was spiraling, the tension palpable. Passers-by, who had initially been mere observers, now began to actively whisper amongst themselves. Some looked visibly indignant, others simply curious, their smartphones now poised, ready to capture the unfolding spectacle. Oren felt his face flush with a deep-seated shame, yet he refused to avert his gaze from the officers. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. "You won't believe who stood by his side. This is just the beginning. It only gets more intense from here." The morning air of Evergreen Heights, which had earlier offered a crisp, serene embrace, now felt thick and heavy with unspoken tension. The officer's words, a barrage of mockery and contempt, echoed in Oren Kincaid's ears. He stood on the sidewalk, a solitary figure surrounded by the escalating curiosity of onlookers, feeling the humiliation burrow deep into his very being. Yet, even in this moment of acute vulnerability, his posture remained unwavering, his gaze steady, though a silent tempest raged within. "Well, Grandpa, since you're so unwilling to cooperate, we'll have to take appropriate measures," Thorn declared, finally lowering Oren's driver's license. But instead of returning it, he casually tucked it into his uniform pocket, a deliberate act of petty defiance. "We have reason to believe you're disturbing the peace, possibly even panhandling, or worse yet, engaging in some form of fraud." Where exactly do you get the money to pay for strangers' meals if you don't even own a car? Croft nodded in agreement, his tone adopting a mock official gravity, though his eyes still gleamed with derision. Yes, sir. We witnessed you paying for that couple's breakfast. It looks suspicious. We are compelled to detain you for further questioning. Detain me? Oren's voice was quiet, infused with a profound sense of disbelief. For what? For paying for someone's breakfast? That is not a crime. It could be part of a larger scheme, Grandpa, Thorne retorted, a sardonic smirk playing on his lips. We don't know who you are. We don't know where your money comes from. And that tattoo. It just screams that you're not who you claim to be. He gestured again at Oren's forearm, this time with an almost visceral distaste. That looks like something gang members get. Or perhaps you've been incarcerated. It bears a striking resemblance to Prison Inc. The scattered onlookers, initially passive observers, now began to actively whisper. A few, particularly the younger ones, had their smartphones out, poised to record the escalating confrontation. Oren felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck, yet he steadfastly held the officers' gazes. He was no criminal. He was a man of honor, whose life had been dedicated to service, and now he was being publicly shamed and humiliated, simply for being old and bearing a tattoo they clearly did not comprehend. I have never been incarcerated, Oren stated, his voice firm, unwavering, and I do not belong to any gangs. I am simply a citizen living my life. Well, that remains to be seen, Croft said, taking a step towards Oren. We'll have to take you down to the precinct, for your own safety, Grandpa, and for the safety of the community. Thorne moved to Oren's other side, and together they grasped his arms, attempting to spin him towards the patrol car. Oren offered no physical resistance, yet his body stiffened. He felt the crude, unyielding grip of their hands, their contemptuous touch. This was more than just an arrest. It was a public spectacle, a demeaning performance staged for the burgeoning crowd. Release me, Oren commanded, his voice a low growl, barely audible above the rising murmur of the onlookers. You have no right to treat me this way. Oh, we do, Grandpa, we absolutely do, Thorne sneered, a smug satisfaction in his voice. We have every right. We are the police. And you're just an old man who doesn't know his place. Perhaps you've forgotten what respect for authority means. Croft, pulling sharply on Oren's arm, tried to twist it behind his back, preparing to apply handcuffs. The motion was abrupt, and Oren felt a sharp twinge of pain in his shoulder. He was old. His joints no longer possessed the pliability of youth. Be careful, a woman's voice cried out from the crowd. It was the young woman who had just exited the cafe, her face contorted in a frown of indignation. Thorne spun towards her, his expression hardening. Stay out of this, ma'am. This is an official arrest. If you continue to interfere, we will be forced to take action against you as well. The woman, intimidated, stepped back, but her eyes remained fixed on Oren, filled with genuine sympathy. Despite the physical discomfort, Oren maintained his composure. He understood that any overt resistance would only exacerbate the situation. He allowed them to wrench his arms behind his back, to fasten the cold, unyielding steel of the handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click of the lock reverberated starkly in the morning's growing cacophony. That's better, Croft muttered, a triumphant smirk on his face. Now you'll behave yourself, Grandpa. They marched him towards the patrol car, pulling open the rear door. Oren, struggling to bend his body with his hands cuffed behind him, attempted to slide onto the seat. Thorne, with a deliberate shove to his back, forced him down, causing him to stumble awkwardly into the vehicle. Shouldn't have resisted, Thorne stated, closing the door with a definitive thud. Now you'll have bigger problems than just that funny tattoo. Oren sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the window. He watched as the onlookers continued to observe, some shaking their heads in silent disapproval, others merely recording on their phones. He felt exposed, utterly humiliated. Yet deep within him, something else began to stir. Not anger, but a cold, unwavering resolve. He would not allow them to break him. He would not allow them to erase his honor. The car lurched forward, slowly pulling away from the cafe. Oren watched the receding Palm Ridge Boulevard, the sign for the Morning Glory Cafe, fading into the distance. The very place where, just minutes ago, he had performed a small act of kindness, and now for that, he was in handcuffs, being driven to a police station, shamed and insulted. During the entire drive to the Evergreen Heights Police Department, located on Oak Crest Drive, the officers continued their self-congratulatory chatter. They mocked Oren, his tattoo, his age. They called him an old weirdo, a ghost of the past, a dinosaur. Oren remained silent, absorbing their words, each one hardening his resolve further. Upon their arrival at the precinct, they were met by the duty sergeant, a middle-aged man with a weary face. "What do we have here, fellas?" Sergeant Samuel Blake asked, his gaze falling upon Oren, whom Thorne and Croft were unceremoniously pulling from the patrol car. "Suspicious subject, Sergeant," Thorne reported, his voice crisp with feigned professionalism. "Charged with disturbing the peace, possibly fraud, uncooperative. And he has a very peculiar tattoo that might indicate a criminal past." Sergeant Blake approached, his gaze sweeping over Oren before settling on his forearm. He frowned, leaning in slightly, trying to discern the faded symbol. "A tattoo?" Sergeant Blake repeated, his voice tinged with skepticism. "And this is why you brought him in? Are you certain you have sufficient grounds for detention?" "Absolutely, Sergeant," Croft asserted, his tone confident. "He paid for someone else's bill, he doesn't own a car, and he lives only 2 blocks away. It's all highly suspicious. And that tattoo—" Sergeant Blake sighed. He was an old school officer, and he disliked seeing young cops abuse their authority. Yet he also knew that sometimes procedure had to be followed. "All right, take him to the interrogation room," the sergeant instructed. "I'll speak with him myself." Thorne and Croft exchanged triumphant glances, clearly pleased that their suspect was about to be grilled. They led Oren down a sterile corridor, past other officers who cast curious glances at the elderly man in handcuffs. Oren walked with his head held high, refusing to let them see how deeply this humiliation wounded him. They escorted him into a small, dimly lit room, furnished with a metal table and 2 chairs. Thorne removed his handcuffs, but did so with a rough jerk that sent another wave of pain through Oren's wrist. "Sit here, Grandpa," Thorne ordered, gesturing towards a chair. "The sergeant will be in shortly, and you'd do well to be cooperative." They exited, leaving Oren alone. He sank onto the cold metal chair, gently rubbing his chafed wrists. He was in a police station, detained without discernible cause, simply because 2 young officers had decided to amuse themselves at his expense. He closed his eyes, attempting to regulate his breathing. His mind, unbidden, replayed memories of far more perilous situations he had navigated throughout his life. Yet, even in those dire circumstances, he had never felt such a profound sense of helplessness and raw injustice. Minutes later, the door creaked open, and Sergeant Blake entered. He sat across from Oren, his face serious, devoid of the earlier mockery that had tainted Thorne's and Croft's expressions. "Mr. Kincaid," Sergeant Blake began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "My officers claim they have reason to believe you've broken the law. Could you explain what transpired?" Oren opened his eyes. "I simply paid for a young couple's breakfast. They appeared to be experiencing financial difficulty. That is all. Your officers stopped me on the street, began to mock my tattoo, and subsequently detained me." Sergeant Blake frowned. He looked at Oren's forearm, attempting once more to discern the faded tattoo. "May I have a closer look at your tattoo, Mr. Kincaid?" Oren extended his arm. Sergeant Blake leaned forward, meticulously examining the faint, angular symbol. His eyebrows rose slightly. He traced the outline with a hesitant finger, his face becoming thoughtful, almost reverent. This is highly unusual," Sergeant Blake murmured, almost to himself. "I've never seen anything quite like it before." He lifted his gaze to meet Oren's. "What does it signify, Mr. Kincaid?" Oren met his eyes squarely. "It signifies that I am a man who served his country, Sergeant, and one who does not deserve this kind of treatment." Sergeant Blake leaned back in his chair, a newfound respect dawning in his eyes. He seemed to grasp something, or at the very least, sense its profound significance. He pulled out his phone and began to rapidly dial. "What's about to happen now? No one expected it. But this is precisely what will restore justice." Zart is the air in the interrogation room, once thick with tension, now hummed with a nascent energy, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Sergeant Blake, who had initially seemed weary and detached, was now focused, his eyes narrowed in intense concentration. His fingers danced across his phone screen, but his gaze kept returning, almost magnetically, to the faded, cryptic tattoo on Oren's forearm. Oren Kincaid sat opposite him, perfectly still, observing the sergeant with an impassive calm, knowing this moment was the pivot point. "Mr. Kincaid," Sergeant Blake began, finally lowering his phone, his voice a low, reverent murmur. "You said this tattoo signifies your service to your country. May I inquire where exactly you served?" Oren exhaled slowly, a quiet release of a long-held breath. "In places not spoken of aloud, Sergeant, and within units that do not appear in newspapers." Sergeant Blake nodded, his eyes narrowing further, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of Oren's words. "Understood. And this tattoo, is it a symbol of a particular unit?" "It is a symbol of allegiance and of remembrance," Oren replied, his gaze unwavering. At that precise moment, the interrogation room door burst open, and Officer Thorne strode in, followed closely by Croft. Their faces, just moments ago etched with a petty sense of triumph, were now a grotesque mask of self-satisfaction. "Well, Sergeant, has he confessed to everything yet?" Thorne asked, a sneer twisting his lips. "I think we can process him and get him into a cell." Sergeant Blake slowly rose to his feet, his gaze, ice-cold and unyielding, fixed on Thorne and Croft. "Officers, I have just concluded a conversation with Captain Marshall of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He is extremely interested in Mr. Kincaid." Thorne's and Croft's faces underwent an instantaneous, grotesque transformation. The self-satisfaction drained away, replaced first by utter bewilderment, then by a rapidly escalating panic. The FBI? Captain Marshall? These were names that commanded genuine awe, even from the most arrogant police officers. "The FBI?" Thorne stammered, his voice cracking, several octaves higher than its usual condescending drawl. "But why the FBI?" "Because Mr. Kincaid is not simply an elderly gentleman with prison ink, as you so eloquently put it." Sergeant Blake's voice sharpened, cutting through the thin air like a whip. "That tattoo, which you so diligently ridiculed, is one of the rarest and most highly classified symbols in the history of American special operations. It belongs to a unit that existed only on paper, but executed the most perilous and critically vital operations during the Cold War. Operations that even many high-ranking officials remain unaware of to this very day." Thorne and Croft blanched, their complexions turning an ashen white. They exchanged terrified glances, their eyes wide with dawning horror. "Mr. Kincaid," Sergeant Blake continued, turning to Oren, his tone now imbued with profound respect. "Captain Marshall informed me that you were a key operative in Operation Midnight Phoenix in the 1970s. You were the one who single-handedly thwarted a large-scale cyber attack on critical U.S. infrastructure, working deep undercover in Eastern Europe. And that tattoo, it is not merely a symbol. It is a unique identifier used for communication with you in the most extreme circumstances. Only a handful of individuals in the highest echelons of command were ever privy to its existence." Oren offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent affirmation of the sergeant's words. You were a spy?" Croft stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably, the full weight of the revelation crashing down upon him. "I was a soldier," Oren replied calmly, his voice steady and resonant, "and I fulfilled my duty." At that precise moment, the unmistakable sound of brisk footsteps echoed down the corridor, and a tall, distinguished man in a sharply tailored suit entered the room. He was followed by two other individuals, also in civilian attire, their faces grim and intensely observant. This was Captain Marshall himself, the regional head of counterintelligence for the FBI. "Mr. Kincaid," Captain Marshall stated, his voice deep and imbued with genuine reverence. He extended his hand to Oren. "It is an honor to finally meet you. Please accept my sincerest apologies for this unfortunate inconvenience. I received Sergeant Blake's call and dispatched immediately." Oren grasped his hand, his grip firm. "No apologies are necessary, Captain. Just a minor misunderstanding." Captain Marshall then turned his piercing gaze towards Thorne and Croft, who stood frozen, their faces a ghastly white. "Officers Thorne and Croft, is that correct?" His voice remained even, yet beneath its calm surface, an undeniable steel permeated every syllable. "I would like to understand on what grounds you detained Mr. Kincaid, and why you saw fit to heap humiliation upon a man who has devoted his entire life to serving this nation with unwavering courage and sacrifice." Thorne opened his mouth, attempting to articulate a defense, but the words caught hopelessly in his throat. Croft, mortified, simply stared at the floor, unable to meet the captain's unwavering gaze. We thought he was suspicious," Thorne finally managed to stammer, his voice barely a whisper. "His tattoo. It looks strange." "Strange?" Captain Marshall's voice dropped several degrees, becoming colder, more menacing. "You, young men, possess not even the slightest glimmer of understanding regarding what true service entails, or what constitutes true honor. That strange tattoo belongs to a man who risked his life every single day so that you could sleep soundly in your beds at night. He fought enemies you have never even heard of, and he did so in the deepest shadows, without a shred of glory or public recognition." He strode purposefully towards Thorne, and with a swift, decisive motion, plucked Oren's driver's license from his pocket. "And you dared to confiscate his identification? To detain him simply for an act of kindness? This is not merely an abuse of authority, officers. This is a disgrace. A profound disgrace to your badge, and an unconscionable stain upon your department." Sergeant Blake nodded gravely. "I have already contacted the Chief of Police. He will be most displeased." Thorne's and Croft's faces paled even further. The Chief of Police. That phrase echoed like a death knell, signifying the abrupt and ignominious end of their careers. "Mr. Kincaid," Captain Marshall said, returning Oren's license to him, "we extend our deepest apologies for this egregious error. We will ensure that those responsible are held fully accountable for their actions." Oren took his license. He cast a long, appraising look at Thorne and Croft, who stood, heads bowed, their arrogance utterly evaporated. In their eyes now, there was only fear, and perhaps a faint flicker of genuine remorse. "I seek no retribution," Oren stated, his voice calm, resonating with an inner strength that filled the room. I simply wish for these young men to comprehend that respect is not something granted by rank or by age. It is something that must be earned. And that one cannot judge a person based solely on their appearance or what one fails to comprehend. Captain Marshall nodded, a deep sense of agreement etched on his face. Very wise words, Mr. Kincaid, and I am quite certain